Us today on our next and every event we've had, thankfully has been very well attended, because I think that with the help of Steve Dubel on the CLE committee, we've been able to put together topics that are interest not just to our members, but to lawyers across the state. And I want to once again thank the members of the Texas Democratic lawyers and the various chapters that have started standing up across the state for joining us as well today. These webinars are going to be the same time, second Thursday, unless we have some weird change. And for the duration of the pandemic, we're going to continue to make sure they're free, open not just to lawyers, but to non-lawyers. And one thing we've noticed is a lot of attendees who are not necessarily practicing lawyers, but interested in these topics because they're interesting to our citizens and interesting to what's going on. Before we get started with the program itself, as you may recall, last month we had an opportunity to hear a brief message from Senator Royce West. We've also welcomed the opportunity to hear from MJhagar briefly. Harold, go ahead. And she had a schedule conflict, but she taped a special message for our members that I'd like to share with you now. Go ahead, Harold.
Hello, Harris County Democratic Lawyers Association. My name is MJhagar. I'm a Texan, a combat veteran, and a working mom, and I'm running for the U.S. Senate against John Cornyn. I went to UT Austin for my undergrad and my MBA, and then I served in the U.S. Air Force working as an aircraft maintenance officer and then as a combat search and rescue helicopter pilot. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan flying rescue missions. I've also worked 5 years in the healthcare industry and 2 in the tech industry. After serving in the military, I partnered with the lawyers at the ACLU to successfully build a broad coalition of support from both sides of the aisle in DC to overturn the outdated combat exclusion policy, which opened up hundreds of thousands of jobs for women in the military. Now I'm running to be your senator because I think we need more servant leaders in office who know how to put the good of the mission first and bring a healthy dose of Texas values to DC. The whole world is watching what's happening here in Texas, and they're wondering why our elected officials have prioritized politics over public health while they've fumbled their handling of this pandemic. They've been watching us for a while now, though. They've been wondering why we still have kids in cages, why our own governor doesn't want us to vote safely and securely by mail, like 34 other states have managed to figure out. But they also see responsible gun owners crying out for common sense gun safety legislation like universal background checks and millions of Texans peacefully protesting for social justice. By electing pragmatic, solution-oriented servant leaders like myself who have demonstrated an ability to take on the intimidating power structure in Washington, we can do something about it. Look, I've traveled tens of thousands of miles to talk with Texans across the state, and the reality that I have found is that when we're talking to people outside of the political echo chamber, away from the cameras, there's widespread agreement on solutions to the things that are facing our families and our countries the most. Things like access to affordable health care, quality education for our kids. You know, we just need somebody with a proven record of taking on tough fights and serving their country instead of their egos to get our government working for us Texans again, and not just the rich and powerful special interests. I'm a survivor of gun violence. I'm also a responsible gun owner myself. And I'm proud to be endorsed by Everytown, Moms Demand Action, Giffords, Brady, and others who are fighting alongside me for legislation that can and will save lives. I need you on my team, and I hope you'll get involved with the campaign and vote for me on July 14th. Thank you.
And that's obviously a reminder, as I think everybody on this webcast knows, we have a primary coming up, and making sure that our voters are out to make the important decisions that remain on the ballot is obviously critical, especially as we go into November and trying to maintain the enthusiasm to the extent that anything other than Donald Trump is needed for enthusiasm in our base. I want to go ahead and start with introducing the moderator, the fellow that put together this really talented, interesting panel, Christian Menifee. I had the privilege of meeting him when he was a young lawyer at Norton Rose Fulbright. It was interesting because he was obviously very talented, very professional, and just a really nice person, which was good because he had a client that was a complete villain, which is always a smart choice when you're in that situation. Christian is our Harris County Democratic Party candidate for county attorney. He's worked hard, and actually I think you'll see that this is one of the more best versed, diverse panels of folks on an important issue. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Christian Menifee. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Mike. I like to think of myself still as a young lawyer, but certainly I remember that case with Mike, and it was a great experience to learn from such an accomplished attorney. I am Christian Menifee. Again, I'm the Democratic nominee for Harris County Attorney, and I'm super excited to have a solid discussion today with this panel about a very important issue. In the fall of 2013, a young Black woman was attending law school in St. Louis, Missouri. It was a Friday night and it was raining outside, and she was heading to an event, a back to school event, and she didn't have an umbrella, so she wore a hoodie. And she got in her car, and as she got to the end of the block, a police officer immediately pulled her over. Two additional police vehicles immediately approached, and one of the officers jumped out of his car, drew his weapon, and yelled at her to turn off her car, roll down her window, and stick her hands out the window. Now, as they ran her information for the next 10 minutes, she sat there only to find out that they pulled her over solely because there was a call of a suspicious Black person driving with a hoodie on in that neighborhood, her neighborhood. This Black woman who had done well in her life, had gotten good grades, had never once gotten in trouble with the law, was forced to stare down the barrel of a pistol for about 10 minutes. And that law student is not my wife. And if you ask your Black colleagues, your Black friends, chances are they too have a story about a life-changing moment with law enforcement. And that's because racial profiling, excessive force, and even lethal force are problems that have been perpetuated against Black Americans by law enforcement for generations. If you ask the young folks, the Gen Z folks on the street right now demanding justice, they're gonna tell you that this movement is about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain. If you ask millennials, my generation, they'll tell you that this movement is about Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. Now, we can keep going way back to Rodney King and the '92 LA riots, or police officers in the Deep South enforcing Jim Crow laws. But the fact of the matter is, for most of this time period, it's been mainly African Americans who have been fighting this battle. But we're starting to see that now more Americans are acknowledging that there's a problem and are open to discussing the array of solutions that can hopefully lead us to justice. And so I'm super excited that folks are ready to get engaged in that conversation, that we have such a great group of panelists to kind of talk us through some of those proposed solutions today. That group of panelists includes Sarah Leibowitz, I did it, Sarah. Sarah Leibowitz, Policy Director of ACLU Texas, Jay Iyer, who is an Assistant County Attorney with the Harris County Attorney's Office, Candace Weber, who is all things incredible, an activist and lead organizer with Houston Rising and Black Lives Matter Houston, and Reginald McAmey, who is a highly distinguished attorney here in Harris County. We're gonna start this program off with Reginald, who's gonna give us a presentation, should be about 10 minutes, on independent police oversight boards and kind of the role that they have served in this justice movement throughout the country. And with that, I'll turn it over to Reginald.
Thank you, Christian. I'm just going to do an overview. I think it's important for everybody to understand why civilian oversight is important and what's happening around the country. I do, for this presentation, want to thank my assistant for this summer, Ms. Layla Youngdahl. She really was very instrumental in putting this together. And I'm going to go to our share screen and get this started. First, why is it important to have civilian oversight? I think it improves community relations. You get better input from the citizens. It's good not only for the individual that complains, it's good for the police force. It creates trust in the larger community. Now, let's look at several cities that have civilian oversight in different forms around the nation. We'll look at Los Angeles, Detroit, San Francisco, New York, and Houston. Now, there's several types of oversight committees. There's a citizen investigation committee that is basically professionals that look at police allegations of police misconduct. Then there's police and citizen review boards, and then there's citizen appeal panels. And you'll find different types of these throughout the United States right now. Now, the Los Angeles Commission is was formed in 1920, and its function was basically to perform internal investigations. There's no civilian review board that's dedicated to investigating the individual complaints. And there's a fight for the civilian review continues to this day. And we all know about Rodney King and the different things that have happened in Los Angeles. The city has a very well-known history of police brutality. Now, Detroit is unique in that its members are elected. 4 members are appointed by the mayor and subject to approval of the city council, and 7 are elected members. And they can subpoena witnesses, they can appoint fact finders, and they do a very robust job there. They're very involved with their policing in the city there. New York City has a civilian complaint review board. It was introduced in '92 by Mayor Dinkins. The union is really against it. They have fought it, and we'll find that kind of union hostility to all of these review boards. And we'll discuss that more when we talk about the Houston board. San Francisco, it has what's called a Department of Police Accountability. It was established in 1983, and the chief really has the final say in everything that happens. The department policy encourages citizens to come forward, but the final say is with the chief of police. Now, let's talk about Houston. There's multiple examples of police brutality that have occurred here in Houston. You can see that there's a Sebastian Prevost case where a man and his wife were assaulted. The Michael Young case where a police officer beat Michael Young on his head with a nightstick for no reason. We got the present case at Regina Nicholas and Dennis Tuttle with the no-knock. We know about that. Michael Doyle, that is president, HCDLA, is very involved with that case. Now, Houston has an independent police oversight board. It was created in 2011. It's comprised of 29 volunteers. They review HPD investigations of misconduct, and they make recommendations. They have no subpoena power. The HPD officers can offer information at their discretion. There's no independent investigation mechanism. There's no public access, accessibility to facilities, and the police chief has the final say. I have had several clients that have filed complaints with internal affairs, and they've basically gone nowhere with HPD. Recently, Mayor Sylvester Turner commissioned a panel of 49 people led by Larry Payne. And in fact, they are meeting today to try to get that kicked off. That will be very interesting to see what they come up with. I hope they come up with subpoena power and more teeth to the Houston board. This is the process if an internal affairs complaint is filed. The citizen may make a complaint. The complainant is not given any information until the investigation is completed. Most complaints from non-police officers do not result in any finding of any police misconduct. The citizen has no right of appeal, and there's appears to me to be a significant code of silence here at the City of Houston Police Department. Now, this comes from the Houston Police Handbook for the public, and this talks about the options for reporting police misconduct. They can request to speak to the officer's immediate supervisor, make a complaint to any supervisor at any police station, or they can complete a complaint of excessive force by a police officer. And the form is included in the handout that the City of Houston Police put out. It's been said by community activists is that the Houston Independent Police Oversight Board is just window dressing. Now, the latest statistics that I could find were from the Texas Observer was in 2013. Out of 706 excessive force complaints, less than 0.2% resulted in discipline to officers from the City of Houston Police Department. Further statistics were regarding shootings. Out of 550 shootings, this is up to 2013, 550 shooting investigations, no officers were disciplined, 0. I'm not sure what the number is up to 2020, but I don't think it's much different. So I think a big part of oversight has to deal with the unions. It is amazing the position that the City of Houston police union takes. And I think it's kind of because it's an occupying force. Now, what do I mean by an occupying force? I looked at the statistics on how many City of Houston police officers actually live in the city. Only 1,658 City of Houston police officers live in the city out of 5,300. That is saying 69%, almost 70% of police live outside of the City of Houston. And it's almost like an occupying force. They come into the city, they have no really skin in the game, so to speak, as far as living in the city with the people that they're supposedly protecting and serving. So holding the police departments and individuals accountable is very crucial for trust from the citizens and so that police can do their job. These are the sources for this brief PowerPoint. I'm going to turn it back over to Christian now and stop sharing so that we can continue. Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Reginald, for that important information. So let's get to some of the questions and get the rest of the panelists involved in this. Jay, we'll start with you. The idea of citizens review boards seems to be strongly supported by everyday people who agree that law enforcement should be independently policed. But given some of the inadequacies that Reginald just mentioned, and I can give a firsthand account to these inadequacies, having served on the Independent Police Oversight Board for 2 years here in Houston. How important do you think these boards are in the bundle of solutions to achieving real change in policing?
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks, Reginald, for that great presentation. It's certainly one part of it, and I think it's a relatively small part of it. And let me tell you why. I think when we think about the sort of systemic things that need to be done with law enforcement, we need to think of it in 2 ways. Number one, these are the Citizen Review Board really attempting to hold individual officers accountable. But what I think is a far more egregious and far more challenging problem is the systemic and cultural issues that exist within law enforcement. And so what we need to really be able to look at, and I think address things like, from a legal perspective, not just the qualified immunity issues that individual officers have, but some of the issues around what's called the Monell Doctrine, which deals with how municipalities are able to be held accountable, because transparency is important on an individual level, and we want to hold individual officers accountable. But if we don't, just much like we do with corporations in terms of civil tort, if you do not hold the underlying entity in this case, whether it's police departments and it's municipalities and it's counties, if you don't hold them accountable, then you're never going to get the change, because what we have right now is a system that essentially incentivizes local governments and law enforcement to hide and deny that the problem exists, because it exposes them to civil liability. And so until we change that element of it, I am a huge fan of of having independent police oversight boards. We need to have them. We need citizen input. But even on that level, we need to think about, what does that mean in terms of subpoena power? What does it mean in terms of being able to refer to grand juries directly and not deal with chiefs of police or commissioners, which can be problematic in itself? So there's a lot of moving pieces. This is one part. It's an important part, but there's a much more broad, I think, systemic concern. And so that would be the thing that I would want to spend more time and resources on.
So Reginald, Jay makes a good point, right? These independent boards are an important part, though they're not the only one. So in trying to strengthen that particular part of the bundle of solutions, how do we give more teeth to these types of boards and ensure that they have full independence from local law enforcement?
I think from what I have seen, you have to decouple the union and the police chief from the discipline of the officers. It needs to be an independent panel. And years ago, I ran for district attorney here. And part of my platform was there needs to be an independent board with subpoena power and discipline power, uncoupled from the police chief and the union, so that action can be taken. What happens with the union is, and the police chief, they want to work together, and unfortunately, they work together to the detriment of the citizens in many of these cases. Jay brings up a very good point about the Monell Doctrine, which basically says the employer, which is the police department, doesn't have to pay anything, or the city doesn't have to pay anything if you can't prove that it was a pattern or policy of the city. And if you can only sue the police officer that does that, there's no incentive for the city to really make sure that the training they're giving has any teeth to it.
Right. Thank you, Reginald. So let's take a step back just a little bit. Candace, I'm going to kick it over to you. The recent protests erupted in response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. But as I mentioned in my introduction, for many Black Americans, this moment is just a culmination of a history of government-sanctioned violence against Black Americans, a history that is rooted in structural racism. And so since you're the person on the panel who we're most likely to see on the Chronicle for being in the street, what are some lessons from our history that should inform how we respond today?
I think one of the biggest lessons we can take from history on how to respond to police brutality today is to fully understand the history of law enforcement and why they exist in the first place. Law enforcement, they were slave catchers, okay? And I mean, there are different thoughts on this. You know, some people don't necessarily believe it. No, it's the truth. You know, law enforcement started out as slave catchers. And nowadays, you know, people in Texas, when they get really excited, you know, they're like, we're going to send in the Texas Rangers to investigate this case. The Texas Rangers, those were the worst of the slave catchers. So people like me hearing the Texas Rangers come in, that doesn't excite me at all. This has been consistent throughout American history. You said earlier, you know, if breaking down by generations, we will tell you the people that we have had to protest for, fight for, we know they've been murdered by cops, and there's no other way to say it. This history of, you know, I like to call them the fraternal order of slave catchers. This history has always been rooted in fear. White people, colonizers, have always thought that we were people that needed to be controlled, and they had no problems with going to whatever length they needed to maintain control over us. the integration of the Ku Klux Klan into law enforcement creates sympathy within the community. White people look at law enforcement because that used to be their uncles and their brothers and their husbands in those sheets that had infiltrated law enforcement. So the community, the white community, sees law enforcement, no matter what their history is, as the good guys, because they've already been programmed to see my Black skin as criminal. So looking at history, you know, if we're going to be responsible, if we're going to be truthful in moving forward to a safe, a better way of creating safe communities, remove the word reform from your vocabulary in this respect. If you understand the history of policing, if you truly understand what Black people have gone through at the hands of law enforcement over and over and over again, beating us, raping us, torturing us, lynching us, shooting us in broad open daylight, videoed with the whole world seeing it, and they still get away with it. When you look at those things that we've gone through in history, reform is no longer an option. You know, that's kind of like telling the battered wife that, yes, we understand your husband has beat you all of the time you've been married, but we had a conversation with him and he promises not to do it again. No.
Right,
So.
and Candace, I've heard that argument a few times, and I think it is an interesting point, and so yeah, so you know, we're going to get into this abolition and defunding conversation, but really quickly before we do, let me shoot a quick one over to you, Sarah. Further on, you know, the point that Candace has mentioned, like, look, we've been protesting for folks who have been murdered by police officers for years now. The other day, I was on Twitter and I saw John Cornyn kind of hinting that there may be a greater problem between law enforcement and Black people. And I was shocked because, you know, this is a guy who's been in the Senate since 2002 and has never acknowledged systemic racism. And then that same day, I saw that there was a WAPO poll that showed that in 2014, 43% of Americans said that after Mike Brown's murder, they thought that there was some greater issue between law enforcement and Black people. But now it's up to 69%. So what do you think is the reason behind that public opinion shift, which I would argue is the reason behind John Cornyn's shift?
Yeah, it's astounding to see how quickly that shift has happened. And Candace, we were out on Saturday at the car rally that we did downtown. And I mean, you made the point that Black-led organizations have been making this case for years. And now there is a much expanded coalition of groups, include the ACLU in this, who are coming to the party. And I think I'm not a public opinion expert, maybe Jay is a public opinion expert, but it's, you know, when you look at the data, we just did a report along with Black Lives Matter and Texas Appleseed and the Justice Collaborative on policing in Houston. And the data is just, you know, Black people make up 23% of the population in Houston. They make up 36% of police stops, 49% of citation eligible arrests, 63% of people shot by HPD. And Black people are 9 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. And I think that those kinds of facts are very stark, and people see that in their communities, and it's not right. And it's coupled with the dramatic cell phone videos. And I think, you know, these are bystander videos. These are not body cam footage videos. These are people watching, recording, uploading videos, sharing through social networks, and that's driving people into the streets. And I'm very interested to see what we can do with that momentum and that movement, because it does feel like there is a moment when deep change is possible. So,
Sarah, those are 2 great points, right? So it seems like we're all agreeing that there's a problem, and the reason is because the data is kind of irrefutable, and you have kind of the increase of video footage from cell phones and technology. So we're pretty much on the same page that there's a problem, but I think where many Americans are diverging is how we solve this problem. There are a bunch of approaches out there, ranging from reforms that require more police funding to full abolition of police departments. And I see in the list of participants, Judge Sandel, who just recently had Alex Vitale on one of his breakfast chats, who wrote a very important book on this idea of the end of policing. So I know on this panel, we may have views all over the spectrum, but I'm going to turn it over to Jay. Jay, do you think that reforms that require more police spending are the answer here, or would you propose something else?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think first and foremost, there's sort of two things we need to think about on this. One is there is this urban mythology or this notion that has been around with policing for a very long time, and that is that in order to reduce crime, you spend more money on cops and you have more police on the street. The data is completely backwards on that. But it's a narrative that has existed. It's permeated. And I think probably it reached its apex during the '94 crime bill, where there was a sort of this recurring mantra of adding 100,000 more police officers on the streets, 200,000 more police officers on the streets. And you see frankly with Mayor Turner when he was talking about wanting to have another cadet class and expanding the number of police officers. The simple fact of the matter is there's no correlation in the data that says crime rates go down based on the number of police. It's like the idea of saying adding more firefighters would mean less fires. It's preposterous on its face, but we treat it that way. 40% of local government budgets are police. The singular problem we have with police budgets, and I know we might talk about this later, is that there's no accountability and transparency about what they spend their money on. That is not the case with any other department at the local level. We know more about public works and solid waste, every other department, public health. We know nothing about what they spend money on. And when you see objective audits happen, right? This was a third-party audit. When you look at the Harding Street disaster that took place, you see an internal audit that was done by handpicked people, and it shows the ripe corruption that exists. I guarantee you that you would see very similar kinds of things if you looked at many departments. Mind you, this is not even an external audit, or not even an audit by the city controller. And so part of the problem is we blanketly throw money at them without any accountability. The budget, when I was chief of staff for Mayor Brown, the number of police officers is the exact same number that we have today, except the budget has increased. It's almost doubled in that time with no appreciable reduction we continue to be a safe city. So we're over policing, and we are over criminalizing activity, as Sarah had mentioned. And we're throwing money at a problem when we're not understanding what that problem is.
Christian, could I say something?
Yeah, I was actually coming to you next, and you can say what you were thinking generally, but I also want to pose to you, if we take what the police officers, some of the officers I've heard the arguments they've made, if we take their argument on its face, why divest any funds? Can we not just use transparency and accountability reforms to get where we're trying to go here, or do we need to divest funds? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Reginald.
Yeah, I wouldn't say divest funds. I'd say redirect funds. There are evil people in the world, so we do need police, okay? But we don't need the police picking on little, teenagers and picking them up for marijuana or watching people because they're black and they got a hoodie on. We need police that live in the city, they got skin in the game because their neighbor is also somebody that they're going to be policing. We can't have police living in Montgomery or something and they can leave and they come back and they're just an occupying force in the city. And we need accountability. We need accountability. And we need funds where they have militarized the police. Those funds need to go to social programs. In other words, have programs for teenagers where they can learn, computers and other things, and have things to do after they get home from school, get people off the street. Social programs to help people that need job training. Take the money away from this militarization, and just have policing for the most horrendous crimes where people are not safe, or you got somebody killing people, breaking into homes and that kind of stuff. They need to be off the street. But if somebody is out selling single cigarettes, to try to feed his family, you shouldn't be killing them. You know, you give them a ticket or something. So that's where I'm at. And accountability.
Can I address just one point?
Yeah, so I was actually coming straight to you, Candace. You know, I don't think what Reginald is saying is, you guys keep reading my mind, actually. I don't think what Reginald is saying is that much different from what Jay was saying, in that, you know, police serve a purpose, but it's a matter of how much we've been spending on police and whether, you know, that money is being effectively used. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I suspect we have a spectrum of views here. And I suspect, Candace, you're closest to the full-on abolitionist view. So, you know, assuming that that's true, I have an opportunity to let us know, what does public safety look like in a city like Houston if we were to kind of fully defund the police?
So first, I'm going to start with the idea that putting cops in our neighborhoods that come from our neighborhoods would work better is not true. Putting cops in our neighborhoods is putting cops in our neighborhoods. It doesn't matter where they live. Before they donned that blue uniform, they have now donned that blue uniform and they have checked yes on that code of silence. So Pookie down the block, I've always known him. And now you're gonna come over here in a uniform and tell me what to do? No, that's not gonna work either. And I know that's not going to work because I'm in this community. I talk to people in this community, right? This is what I do. So yeah, it sounds nice, but you know, I think we're trying to have an honest conversation about where this needs to go, and it doesn't really need no more cops. None. We don't need any more cops at all. And we do need to aggressively defund the police force. We don't, and when we talk about defund, we mean, yes, take that money take that $20 million that you just gave and put that into social services, right? One of the excuses that cops use for brutality is they're overworked and they see someone who I, as a nurse, would think this person is in a mental crisis. They see someone and they think, you know, this person is aggressive, they're on drugs, I fear for my life, they're gonna, you know, hurt me, I better get them first, bang, bang. And the body cam's not on, right? So they're not equipped to do certain things. Now, instead of me, the regular old taxpayer, being burdened by continuing to keep that money in law enforcement when we know it is not effective, take that money that I am already paying and shift that to things that do work, like mobile access, mobile crisis units. So when we come up on people and we know that they're not acting normally, we have someone to call and make that very clear, make it widely known. Stop consent searches. The reality of it is, if you pull somebody over, you pull a Black person over and they say, and the cop says, I need you to get out of the car so I can search it. That Black person doesn't have an option. He does not have the right to say no to a search. Because if he says no to a search, that cop can kill him while he's sitting in his car. And once again, that code of silence got that cop's back. So we need to stop these consent searches. Black people don't have the right to deny consent searches. Maximize opportunities early for children in the community. Once again, take that money, put it back in the community. Those are the things that really do keep us safe. Partner with unions. So, you know, spend that money teaching kids trades. A lot of times, our children are not out there just being bad. They're not bad people. We're not criminals by nature. A lot of these crimes that are being committed are low level and they are crimes of survival. So see it for what it is. If you see a Black woman and she's got 4 kids and she's in Target and you bust her shoplifting, she's not shoplifting to be a thief. She's shoplifting because her children need clothes. Meet those needs. That Black woman in that Target is a taxpayer too. Most importantly, her babies are innocent. Take that money that we use training these cops that will slam that Black woman up against a car and throw handcuffs on her in front of her 4 children and traumatize them. Throw that money back into services that will help that mother find jobs, help that mother with childcare so she can go to a job. Those are the things that make us safer. We don't want to be low-level criminals. We want to thrive. So give us back our money that you have been using to torture us so we can create programs and we can thrive.
So Candace, I think you made a good point. You know, Reginald, I think, was focusing more kind of on that, how we protect civilians from violent crimes. And you're talking more about, you know, diverting funds for social services. So I'm going to go to Jay, and then Sarah, you'll be next. Jay, I'll let you be the tiebreaker here. If we, you know, completely defund the police, what is public safety for violent crimes going to look like? Are we going to create a new apparatus that effectively serves the same function for police, but just for that very narrow scope? Or is it going to be something else?
No, I think that's right. I think you're going to have a very narrow, finite sort of thing, right? It's the detective work. I think I saw one of the comments, sort of detective work versus patrolling. I think the issue is whether or not are you going to go out there rooting out, looking for crime, or are you going to try to solve the crime that we have? And that, I think, is just a big difference, right? We spend a lot of time, when you look at the issues surrounding the incidences of people sort of being stopped, the harassment and the brutality, it's largely because of excessive patrolling, excessive enforcement, not because of sort of trying to solve, who stole my toaster, or who stole my car, or auto accidents, or the kinds of routine elements involved when there is in fact a conflict. And that, I think, is what you're going to see, right? That's the shift that you have to see. When you look at what they've done in sort of Camden, New Jersey, which has sort of been hailed as a bit of a model, that's largely what they've done. They've used their sheriff's department to serve that broader function, and they've really reinvested in a more neighborhood-oriented approach, where it's much more community-oriented empowerment. I saw Judge Sandler reference the British model to some extent, some of that types of things that they're doing there in Camden. I think those are the kinds of things we can do in a broader strategy. And I would like to use, what we're talking about is reinventing the way we do law enforcement. Mm-hmm. We need a complete reboot. When we talk about corporations, when they go into Chapter 11, you're rebooting it, you're restarting it, you're reimagining it. That's what we need to talk about, because the reform model for the last 20, 30 years is effectively just dealing with things along the edges. It doesn't solve the systemic and endemic problems that exist.
So Sarah, both Candace and Reginald have mentioned this idea that there's a bad culture in policing. We have a bunch of attorneys. I think we have about 200 participants on here, and I assume that, the majority of folks are attorneys. And, lawyers, we often get a bad rap, but one thing about our profession is we are great at self-policing, or some may call it snitching. A lawyer will tell on an unethical lawyer at a moment's notice, but we don't see that same kind of culture in policing. How do we change that culture in law enforcement?
Yeah, and it goes back to something that was mentioned earlier, which is about accountability, that you have to change the incentives. And that is, I think, part of a fundamental reimagination, that people everywhere, institutions, respond to incentives. And so if there is no accountability, if the slide that Reginald shared at the beginning was 500 investigations, shooting investigations by the Oversight Board and no consequences, then there's no way that a culture changes without accountability for that level of misconduct. So that's got to be part of it. And I do want to go back quickly to the previous question, because cities know that they spend too much money on policing. One of the things that we've done is look at the city's own reporting. The city of Houston commissioned a $500,000 study on financial sustainability for the city, and a significant portion of its recommendations deal with the 34% of the city budget that is for police. So, Dallas did a 400-page study about how they could save money on staffing in the police department, because cities everywhere are in a budget crisis, and they are examining, as they should, why they're spending so much and how they can save money through consolidation, site and release. It's the same thing that people are saying everywhere. Cities themselves know that this is part of the solution, and it's a matter of assembling the political will to get it done.
If I can just add to that, I'm a nurse, and I think nurses we might just snitch on each other a little bit faster than lawyers, right? And we have a code of ethics, right? Just like any other institution, but things that we have in place that police officers don't have. And the general public, they love me. You know, they love nurses, okay? So we're doing what we're supposed to do. I think that first, they need governing boards, like statewide governing boards. And the responsibility of that governing board needs to be very clear. The governing board is not there to protect the police officer, as my governing board is not there to protect me. Those governing boards exist to protect the public from the public servant. And that means at any point, if I step out of my boundaries, because my governing board has already defined them for me, if I step out of those boundaries, I have got to answer to my peers who have been taught that they are to protect the public from me. Changes the conversation completely. We need whistleblowers, right? If as a nurse, if I find out that a doctor is stealing money from Medicare, I blow the whistle. Not only do I get to keep my job, but guess what I get? I think it's like 1% of the money that they've stolen, right? So the incentive to tell the truth, to like let them know, hey, this guy over here is not doing the right thing. We need to change that. The duty to report has to exist. They don't have a duty to report. They have a duty to conceal. And that right there has got to change. If you want to create an environment where cops are held accountable, look at the model for professional nursing. Professional, we get continuing education. The board still cares for us, right? They drive us to be better clinicians. But I can't mess up here in Houston and go anywhere else. 34 states, it's called a compact license. If I mess up here in Texas, my record follows me for 34 states. You put that accountability. That is accountability.
Sorry. Can I just pile on? Sorry, Christian. I don't know if anybody else dialed into the Public Safety Committee meeting of City Council a few weeks ago, at June 25th. And I love a public meeting. It went on for 8 hours.
Yeah.
And it was so powerful to listen to people, the teachers and the nurses and the hairdressers who called in and said, I have standards for my professional conduct that are higher than what the police are held to. And it was just over and over again to hear people talk about how normal it is to be held to professional account when you are a trained professional, especially in public service. It seems it was a powerful and obvious point.
Right. And it's an expectation. Like nobody gets upset when your nurse manager comes up to you, and I've been the nurse manager, and I have to walk up to just some random person. I get an email from HR and it says, this employee of yours, it's their time for the random drug screen. We know the drug screen's coming, right? We're not upset about that. That is just how accountability works, because I have people's lives in my hand.
Well, and Candace, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Candace. I was going to say that's a great point, because if you think about it, here domestically, the only profession where you're permitted to intentionally take a life is law enforcement, right? And so, Reginald, let me bring into this conversation, you know, kind of sticking on this comparison between professionals and law enforcement. You know as well as any of us that right now any person can go on the State Bar website and see if an attorney has been punished, right? And if you Google around enough, you can probably find out what that attorney did. How do we kind of similarly increase that sort of transparency for law enforcement?
I think it's very simple. I think it's like Ms. Weber says, just make the discipline that is meted out to the police officers, follow them, and have a database. And you know, while we're on this, I want to thank Ms. Weber and Black Lives Matter for getting us to the point where we are. If there were not people in the streets, we wouldn't be having this discussion. So, you know, we need to have accountability, and we need to be able to have a database so that these officers can't go from county to county and city to city And I agree with many things that Ms. Weber has said and that Jay has said. But being a defense attorney for 34 years in the criminal system, representing people, I know there are evil people out there. And we cannot have rapists and serial killers and people robbing businesses and have a society that we want to live in. So there is law enforcement that can work. In other countries, they don't have police killings every day. Some countries have police forces and, they might have 2 police incidents the entire year. So we know if you look around the world that policing can work without the death and destruction that the American system has right now. So, I think to get back to your question, Christian, is there needs to be a database. And when, just like there's a database for sex offenders, there's a database for people that, other professions. It needs to follow people so that the community will be safe. It gets back to the basic thing of trust. Does the community trust the police department? Does the community trust the government? And as has been talked about, if you're out on the street and the police officer says, I want to look in your car, and you say, nah, I don't want you looking in my car. They're either going to look in your car or they're going to take you downtown. And I can tell you that personally. I've been there personally. Police officer wanted to look in my car. I said, no, you don't have the right to look in my car. I was at that point arrested. Okay. So it happens. So I don't know. I hope I answered your question, Christian. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you did. I mean, I think it still sounds like, the core of what you're saying is, look, there are some violent crimes that occur out there and we need to have a police system in place that can handle those. And I heard kind of a variation of that argument on a recent panel. And Jay, I actually want to pose this one to you. So I moderated a recent panel for the Houston Young Lawyers Association, and the chief of police here in Houston was one of the panelists. And one of the, I think, interesting points that he made was, look, I'm hearing the calls for redirecting funds from police departments, but we should not redirect any funds from the police department until we have these other social services programs like Candace and Reginald and Sarah have talked about already in place, right? And I think the analogy he used was, well, if I'm a football team and I'm in a stadium, don't move me from my old stadium until you already build me a new stadium. I just want to get your response to that. I think it's an interesting argument. I've heard him make it a few times. So I'm wondering your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two things with it. One, that assumes that the current level of funding that the police have and the current level of personnel they have is either A, inadequate, or that's a baseline or a necessity to have. I think what the argument really is that we have too many. We have too many resources dedicated to law enforcement that are being used in an inefficient way. And so where I would very much disagree with Chief Acevedo on is that this notion that you have to wait until you build new structures or spend more money before you cut what in many cases is an overfunding of the police. I go back to the accountability thing, and I think Candace talked about it, and Sarah's talked about it, and Reg talked about it early on. There needs to be general accountability about how we spend resources and allocate resources with law enforcement. Fundamentally, that's based in this entire argument is why do we need more police if the current level of policing has kept the rates the way they are, and that the amount of police we have is resulting in outcomes that we do not like. And that to me is the fundamental issue here. Until we get past that, we need to understand, we need to have a 21st century policing model that de-emphasizes random stopping, because it's not just about killing, it's about people being stopped on the street randomly, people being stopped in their cars. It's a much broader conversation. It needs to be reinvented. It needs to be reimagined. Frankly, it needs to be modernized. This is a 19th century institution that we continue to rule, that we continue to use today. We've changed everything else. We've modernized everything else. Let's bring it into the modern era.
Christian, can I say something just real quick?
Yeah, sure.
On that issue. Look, money needs to be redirected to mental health. Does anyone appreciate how many people are in Harris County Jail because they are mentally ill?
The largest mental health institute. What? Yes. Yes.
It has to be redirected to mental health and to homelessness. And so that's what we have to do, and we have to have accountability. Thank you.
Christian, can I jump in? There's a couple questions, and obviously this is just looking at the chat. We have a very engaged crowd of folks that are really getting a lot out of this. Is it okay? I don't want to step on your toe too much. Is it okay if we answer a few of the questions or put those out for the panel?
Happy to turn it over to Missouri City Mike.
Mo City Mike, no, thank you. And actually, for those that are following the chat, Alex Vitale, who's actually a native Houstonian, graduated from Straight Jesuit my year in '83, is actually the author of End of Policing. His book, which addresses a lot of these topics, he was heard at Judge Sandals' breakfast last week. I put it in the chat function. There's a free ebook download. A lot of these issues, in particular, for example, what he saw on the streets when he was working at homeless out in San Francisco, assistance in the '80s, where they were cutting mental health while they were increasing policing and more or less moving the responsibility, is explained in his book. First question, this is obviously for anybody on the panel, has to do with kind of what Alex Vitale is at, and how is this going to look? And it may be JR, it may be anybody else. What's it going to look like if you talk about defunding the police? Does that mean what Reginald was talking about, that rapists aren't going to be caught, or what does that really look like if we're talking specifics?
I'd like to start on that one. First, when we asked the question, what is that going to look like in response to public safety? It's important for us to take a personal inventory of what we are really asking and check our biases before we get into a discussion about defunding and shifting to a public safety model that has not been seen in this country. Because Black people are not, we're the ones being over-policed, and Black people are not criminals. So, and that's why I say really interrogate why you are asking that question first. Now, once you, and be honest with yourself, you can't lie to God, don't lie to yourself. Be honest when you ask yourself, why am I asking this question, right? After that, I think that we need to center community. Let's find out what that looks like for the community. So what public safety looks like for me, quite honestly, is not seeing cops driving in my neighborhood. That makes me nervous because there's little Black boys and little Black girls that are fixing to come in contact with them. So that's my personal idea of what public safety looks like. We all have them. And one of the problems that we have right now is Black and brown people do not have the ability to self-determine their lives. There's always somebody else, and I'm gonna be very frank here. There's always some white man that doesn't know what it's like to be Black, to be brown, to be a woman, to be poor. They don't know what that's like, and they're the ones that are making the rules for my community. So let's have this conversation with the community. Let's not write this ourselves.
Yeah, I'd like to just say something. And you're right. There are white police officers that have done some horrendous things. I have represented people that have been harmed significantly by Black police officers. It's a blue issue. It's, what we have to focus on is not the right or left, but what's right or wrong. And, it's a blue issue. And oftentimes when people put on that uniform, they want to just, they get a Napoleon complex and they want to just be able to be the boss and take out their aggressions on people. So what we have to focus on is the training for police, the mental health of police. I had a case where the police officer was actually on psychotropic medication when he assaulted my client. There needs to be some checks on what their mental health is when they're out policing our community. So,
and if I can jump in really quickly, Mike, I think, part of what it's going to look like is going to be different from city to city, right? If you have a city that has a bunch of violent crimes, I think the idea that kind of Candace has been mentioning is you have to tear this institution that is historically and systemically racist. You have to tear it apart. And then you may decide to build a new public safety organism that is very narrow in what it's charged to do, right? This only deals with violent crimes. And so by narrowing that scope, you'll narrow the funding that goes to it, and you'll narrow the general focus of those particular departments that work in tandem on like which types of crimes they're trying to seek out, you know, with like use of force, which types of issues they're sending people who are not armed, who are just first responders in a different sense. But I think that's going to look different from city to city.
Thanks.
Can I also pick up on something that, Candace, I think in your response, something that struck me is that there's this sense when we ask this question that we tend to go to the sort of most extreme example that makes us feel powerless to get started. And what we've been focused on in Houston in collaboration with a bunch of other groups is what we called it the Justice Can't Wait Independence Day agenda for Houston policing, because there are a bunch of things that we already know that can get done right now that we do not have to wait for. So it's common sense things. It's things like introduce and vote on a cite and release ordinance. Let's stop arresting people for low-level stuff. It is redirecting funds for emergency response. This is a tested model, and we don't need police showing up to mental health crises. You know, there are things that we can do right now to get started, and we don't need this. If we don't take advantage of this moment and begin to act, I think that the risk is that the moment will pass. And so we're very focused on how do we keep the momentum going so that we get things done. And I think listening to Chief Acevedo talk about how we have to wait for a national model before we can act locally is just, it's a recipe for maintaining the status quo. And we have to push against that. And I think there are things that the mayor, the chief, and city council can do immediately based on things that they already know, and they should do it.
Thanks.
I just wanted to add one thing, and because this is a legal group, and so I wanted to throw in and put our lawyer hats on back for 1 second, because one of the things I think that we don't talk enough about is the notion of the accountability piece to the municipalities and to the departments themselves. When we talk about the culture change, we talk about the systemic issues. I mean, one of the problems that we have is that if you don't hold, we know this from basic civil tort law, if you don't hold employers accountable for the actions of their employees when they're doing something that is egregious and unconstitutional, then that behavior tends to continue. And what we've seen, because of some of the legal barriers that are in place right now, we have a situation where there's a tendency to throw everything in the closet and not want to reform. This problem would not exist if municipalities and county governments and departments had an incentive to clean up. They do not now. The civil lawyers out there in the audience, if you've ever done any civil actions against municipalities, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You simply don't have those structures in place because of not just qualified immunity, but the Monell Doctrine that we mentioned earlier. All of that needs to be part of this, because if you can't hold employers accountable, you're never going to get the change you need.
I'll give everybody a heads up. We've hit about our limit, but we're going to let this extend because we have a very engaged chat, and I think we have time for a few more questions. So please forgive me for our first in at least a year and a half going a little bit over time, but thank you. You can always log off if you want to, but I doubt many people will with this kind of panel. Second question, which I think goes directly from what Jay visited with, and I know Candace raised it. Texas is one of the few states, and we have a question about this specifically, that doesn't have a whistleblower or protection for honest reporters, folks who might step forward on the code of silence. And I know you mentioned that briefly, Candace, and that's kind of flowing from what you're talking about, Jay. What are y'all's thoughts about that particular important piece of the puzzle, or not?
Well, if they really want to, if one bad apple is the hill they're going to die on, ass up the bad apple. That's it, right? If that is what you're saying, it's not all of us. Most of us are really good guys. It's just those few that end up on TV. Why do I have to wait for them to end up on TV before you start talking about how that's just the bad apple? Define what is appropriate behavior. Define what is inappropriate. Define your boundaries and stay within them. And when we see people step outside those boundaries, me as a clinician, I have a duty to protect the integrity of my institution as well. so people continue to love the nurses. I'm going to report it, you know? And when I report these things, because I have reported bad nurses, when I've made these reports, I did not worry about losing my job. So.
Well, and Texas does have a protection for healthcare providers to do exactly what you're talking about. They don't have it for other government folks, and particularly in law enforcement. Jay, what do you think about that piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, no, I agree with it. I think, I mean, look, what we're talking about at the end of the day is trying to augment and change the culture of the institution, and that culture and practice needs to be sort of in there. One of the problems, and it goes back from when we talked about it with litigation, is that if you can't prove that custom and practice, you can't deal with the accountability. You can't hold the institution accountable if you don't know that that's consistent with what their pattern and practice of behavior is. And there's a disincentive in the system to essentially want that to happen. So line officers are told, hey, just, you know, you got the blue code, you can't deviate. The union, which we didn't get a chance to really talk about, has built that structure in place because it's not really designed well for them to do it. The municipality doesn't want to investigate themselves. They don't want to look into it themselves. And so when you see third parties, when you see major public botches like Harding Street happen, only then they go in, you look under you open up the closet, and it's filled with a pattern and practice of problems that hasn't been dealt with. And so yeah, I absolutely agree. You need a structure in place that's going to make people want to be able to share what they know and expose folks.
Thanks. All right. Go ahead, Sarah. Apologies.
Can I just give a quick shout out also? Jay, thank you for bringing us back to the legal framework, but I also just want to give a shout out to local reporting and some of the work that the Houston Chronicle has done in the last year, especially on policing. It's really, you know, I don't think that we would have gotten the transparency about the Harding Street audit, but for dogged reporting. And I do think that is, we should celebrate that kind of, the role of the press in all of this too.
You know, I also want to bring up with the Harding, that tragedy. We cannot discuss that without discussing the fact that those people were white, and the people that are dying on the usual that don't lead to investigations and cop keeps doing what they're doing are Black and brown. So y'all better get scared, because it looks like it's going to take more white people dying for us to get real safe policing here. Let that shake you up a little bit. Nobody cared about Gerald Goins, you know, faking it and jailing us, you know, dropping weed on people and, you know, then sending them in, you know, nobody cared about that. But he killed those 2 white people. And now we got to do something. So do not forget that. I can't let you guys forget the racial disparities that are always present. Those white people had to die for Gerald Goins to stop tormenting Black people.
Black Lives Matter.
Every day.
So thank you, Candace. And what I was fixing to do was give everybody an opportunity to kind of last thoughts, suggestions. And by the way, being very involved in Harding Street, that's something that I've heard a lot, and I think it makes a lot of sense, because you're right. Unfortunately, it takes someone feeling it close to home, and it could be me, before people start thinking about it. But go ahead, Candace, since you're on the screen, go ahead and share any kind of final other great thoughts that you have for us, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for having these conversations. I think this is very important, especially in venues like this. And thanks for making sure that we get multiple sides of the story. And I think that's very important when we talk about policing. If there's anything that I could leave everyone with, it would be to check your own inherent biases. We all have them, right? Every one of us, we're not free from that. We all need to check that when we are talking about what keeping us safe looks like, and not forget that when we talk about safety, we're not talking just about our personal safety, but the safety of others. So just if this one thing would make me safe, that doesn't mean this one thing will make someone else safe. And my last thing would be, as leaders in the community, as people that are pushing change, push this conversation, push the decisions that need to be made around this conversation back to the people that have been most marginalized and brutalized by police. So and no more task force. Just stop it. They don't work. They don't work. So yeah, let's let the people decide what safe policing looks like, and no more task force. Waste of money. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Candace. Reg, do you have anything else you want to share?
Yeah, I just want to say that I was reading one of the comments there, and they were saying that they doubted that my push for more accountability, that there was no evidence that that would work or more training would work. There's no evidence that it does work because there's been no accountability. So what we have to do, I think, is if you hold people accountable, if they lose their jobs, if they lose their liberty, if they lose their money, I think that officers will have a different attitude about beating people and shooting people and killing people. So I think we need to give accountability a chance. We need to have a board in Houston with teeth, subpoena power, and punishment power. So that's all I have. Thank everyone for coming, all attendees, everyone that's on the panel. It's been very nice to hear all of the competing opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reginald. Jay?
So, Mike, thank you for having me on here. Christian, thanks for moderating it, and Candace and Sarah and Reginald for joining me. This was great. I guess the one thing I would just add that I haven't gotten a chance to sort of reiterate, the one thing that for me that would be a takeaway is transparency. Sunshine is the great disinfectant. We need to have it in all of our institutions, but no more so than in law enforcement. And that is, to me, the single biggest thing. We need to know what we're spending our money on. We need to know why police do what they do, how they do what they do. And I think that will go a long way in helping, I think, reinvent and reimagine how we deal with criminal justice in the broadest sense, because we're only talking about police, but I know Judge Sandals here. He's talked a lot about implicit bias in the judiciary. We've got issues with the criminal justice system in prisons. We've got issues throughout our society, and a lot of that can be solved through transparency, through openness. That's the way you solve these problems, and we've got to create accountability, and you can't do it with people don't know.
Thank you, Jay. Sarah?
Great. Thank you so much. And, you know, I go back to where, Christian, you started us, and this feeling that we are in a moment and that we are here as the result of lots of long, hard organizing by Black-led organizations and Black people. And we are here today because of that organizing. We are in a city where we have a special role, I think, because this is where George Floyd is from, where he is buried, and the city is not doing enough on policing right now. And if there is a final thought, I think it is a sense of possibility for action now, and that we shouldn't waste this moment.
Thank you, Sarah. And then finally, Christian, you did such a great job of bringing these great folks together. What else would you like to share? And thank you, Sarah. What else would you like to kind of parting thought from, because at the end of the day, hopefully all things go well. In about 7 months, you're going to have some responsibility for actually doing some of these things. So go ahead and tell us. We'll put you on the spot a little bit, Christian.
Yeah, so thank you, Mike, very much for allowing me to put this together and moderate this. And thank you to each of the panelists. You guys were incredible, and I appreciate kind of, you know, the back and forth and thoughtful discussion on these issues. I would just echo what Sarah said, like, let's not lose this moment. A few years ago, when I joined the Independent Police Oversight Board, the board is split up into multiple panels. And when I got on the panel, my first case was a police shooting. And, you know, we went and reviewed the information, saw some body-worn camera footage. And the other panelists were just blown away that I disagreed with their conclusion that I did a good job on the investigation. And what that kind of revealed to me was this was a panel that had gotten used to rubber stamping the decisions of the police department. In fact, when we did our training, they brought in a black FBI agent to tell us that the Black Lives Matter movement was nonsense and that law enforcement are typically good people and don't do the things that we see in the media. So, you know, this is a board that has been around for a moment. And I think one of the reasons why it has not been that effective is because you haven't seen a real kind of social movement pushing people to make the right decisions with reforms on this board. So let's not lose this moment in this movement. You know, when I resigned from that board, I wrote a letter saying, look, here are some of the deficiencies with the board, and I'm sure it was thrown in the trash can. But now here we are, and there's a task force that's been created, and we're talking about reforms. So this is a big moment, and I would just echo Sarah in saying that let's hold our elected officials accountable. Like, don't let people go out in the street and join the protests and give you lip service and try to build a political career on the backs of Black and brown people who were murdered by police. Let's hold folks accountable for actual solutions. And when I get in office at the county attorney's office, to the extent that I can, you know, hold the constables accountable, the sheriff's office accountable, I'm going to work with them to institute some real reforms. And you can be sure that I will be on the progressive side of this issue moving forward. But thank you again to this wonderful organization for letting me participate in this. And thank you to each of the panelists for taking your time out today.
Thanks. Just two closing thoughts. We'll have our next one on schedule the next second Tuesday of August, maybe earlier. So please keep an eye out. And then finally, you're going to be getting your due statement. We've been able to keep things going online, but it's obviously not free. Our traditional events that kind of keep our organization thriving like it's been thriving so well. So don't be offended. You'll probably see it coming out this afternoon and one other. We need your help. It's $75. If and when we're back together, that'll get you a free lunch. And this obviously is an organization that has a lot of potential for every single member. Thank you so much. And thank y'all for being here today. And we'll see y'all in another couple weeks. Thank you.